Good afternoon, everybody. My favorite opening trick is to take out my cell phone and then switch it off publicly in the hope that you would all do the same. It's very, very disruptive to have these phones go off. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It gives me great pleasure to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. My job is not to stand in the way of you, between you and him. So I will make my usual 3 points of introduction. The first point I'm going to speak very briefly about the Commonwealth, but frankly, to a Singapore audience, I think most of you know what the Commonwealth is. I have to emphasize it is not the British Commonwealth. This is an association of the states who used to be part of the British Empire, most of them. Although recently, I gather, some non-British Empire states have joined. I gather Mozambique has joined us. They decided to leave the Portuguese Empire to join the British Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Secretariat, which was established in 1965, is the main intergovernmental agency of the Commonwealth, facilitating consultation and cooperation among member states. And Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma was speaking about it. But let me just tell you briefly my own experience with the Commonwealth, and I've attended quite a few meetings of them, is that they provide a wonderful opportunity for leaders and personalities from a very geographically diverse group of states to come together and have a really meaningful conversation. So you have people from South America, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, Australia, New Zealand coming together to have these wonderful conversations. And that's one of the biggest contributions that the Commonwealth has made. And some of you may be aware that one of the key declarations of the Commonwealth was actually issued in Singapore in 1971 in the summit then. Secondly, let me say a brief word about Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma, and let me begin with a confession. I'm a great admirer of his. I've had the great pleasure actually of working together very closely, both when I served as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, he served as India's ambassador to the UN, and we became very good and dear friends in New York. He's a graduate of Delhi University and of King's College in Cambridge. He also holds honorary doctorates from Middlesex and De Montfort Universities in the UK. And he's also been a fellow at Harvard University. Now, having mentioned Harvard University, I'm going to announce a major switch in the program, especially to the media, that Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma thought he was going to come here under Chatham House rules and have an informal, off-the-record conversation with all of us. So the good news is that the media suffers, but we get a much more candid presentation because he's now going to speak off the record to us, which is what happens also in Harvard too. Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma has been in the Foreign Service was in the Foreign Service for 36 years. He's been both permanent representative to the UN in Geneva and also in New York, as I mentioned earlier. He was also India's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. Unlike many diplomats, Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma has also published in many areas. He edited a book of poetry from around the world called Mille Fleurs in the year 2000. And he also produced a volume entitled Imagining Tomorrow, Rethinking the Global Challenge in the year 2000, to which I was happy to contribute an essay also under his leadership. And as a result of the great success that he had in his diplomatic career, he was also appointed as a special representative of the UN to Timor-Leste, or then it's called East Timor. And since this is off the record, I can also be more candid and tell you that when he was first appointed as the UN Special Representative to East Timor, the East Timorese scratched their heads and said, why are they sending this Indian gentleman to us? Why not a British or an American or something like that? And so when he arrived, they were a bit skeptical, But I can tell you that by the time he left East Timor, he had won the hearts and minds of both the leaders and the people, and did a truly impressive job working in Timor-Leste. Building on that success, of course, he was then appointed, most recently, the Commonwealth Secretary General, and now lives in London. Now, finally, on the topic, I gather that Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma said to me as we were walking up here that he'd rather discuss a broader topic of state of global society today, including the Commonwealth. So he may venture into many more other areas than what was originally promised. So with that, Kamalesh, can I turn the floor over to you, and after your remarks, you can have a Q&A session. Ambassador Sharma.
Thank you very much, Kishore. As you can see, Kishore and I go a very long way. And I get worried when people start talking about my CV, because I'm in a stage of life and it's starting to sound a bit like an obituary. There has been an accident with my topic, I admit. The earlier topic which I had suggested was managing transformation and diversity, which are the two compelling phenomena of modern age. But it was felt that many of you, if you read that title, you'll emit a big yawn and do something else this evening. So there was a search for a better title, and I was on leave, and I was consulted on telephone, and I said, well, then what about what makes global society work? So, you've got this title, global is out of it, and this gives the impression of a speaker in my position, which is both audacious and impertinent, because it's going to enter into which society, national society, works and which doesn't work. But I wasn't fazed by this at all, because I recalled that a famous Arab traveler to India, called Al-Biruni, from Morocco, is like Marco Polo, covered many countries, very famous memoirs. When he reached India, he spent a couple of years there, I think, and made many observations about Indians, some of them admiring, some of them more ambiguous. But he said one thing. He says, I've been all over the world, but I have not met any people who have had one characteristic which I see in Indians. And this is their facility to speak eloquently at any length on a subject about which they know nothing at all. So I drew upon this ancestral cultural resource, and I thought, well, even if you want me to speak on this, that's all right. But what I would really like to speak about is something which is before our eyes at all times, which is the phenomenon of flux. We've heard that, flux is something which happens all the time. It's simply an illusion that certain periods of history, time stood still. That never happens. Flux is either visible or subterranean, but it is happening all the time. It's not in the nature of any terrain to be constant. But that may be so, and indeed it is. But process of transformation and its implications can vary in various historical epochs. You mentioned Harvard, Kishore, the president of Harvard University, gave a lecture at Davos, that watering hole of winners. And there he said, what is happening before our eyes is, in my view, more significant in its implications than the Industrial Revolution or the Reformation. Now, the interesting thing is that when the audience heard this, they did not think this was unwarranted hyperbole. Because no matter what field you're in, you see the significance of the flux around you, And you know that the outcome of this is going to be of historic proportions. If you look at the markers we had, and interestingly these were directional markers, the east and the west and the north and the south. I think it's fair to say that most people would have thought in their working lives, people of my age, getting along but still able to stand on their 2 feet, that in our working lives we would never have thought that these markers would cease to exist. But the East and the West disappeared with historic rapidity, and the North and the South is vanishing before our eyes right now. They're evaporating before our eyes right now. Both were, it's appropriate that they were called East, West, North, South, because essentially they were geographical ideas. The world was looked as a space available to you. Many of you would remember a map saying, okay, here is the Soviet Union, deep red. Here are the client states, pink or whatever. And this is what this global space looks like. You can have another map showing where freedom was all over the world and so on. It's very much a geographical idea. So was North and South, although we thought conceptually developed and underdeveloped, it was a geographical idea, because in the end, it meant the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, that's what it was. So you see before you something which nobody anticipated, which is a disappearance of a mental geography. Now this has a significant meaning, because Gestalt psychology tells us that you cannot really imbibe facts and evaluate them unless in a framework of meaning. We are not neutral computers who process data as we get along in a non-neutral way. There's always a framework of meaning in our minds about people, about developments, about inherited cultural prejudices, if you like, or whatever. And you say, all right, this is how it fits in. No, this is surprising. But there's a framework at work which is processing the data. It's not neutral. But if your framework is gone, the four corners, then how do you make the jigsaw puzzle again? What is happening now in politics? What is happening now in economics? The politics had two very interesting features. One was the assumption, because the Soviet Union gave a kind of Cold War stability to the world, in a neutral sense, for many decades, which led to an area and an era later of great rapidity, was, in analysis, seen to be an incomplete notion. Because recently I was reading another Harvard Joe Nye's book, which is The Past to Lead, and basically he says, if Gorbachev hadn't said perestroika, glasnost, and all that had not been handled the way it was, maybe the Soviet Union would have lasted another 10 years. What he was saying was it was not political mismanagement. It was social mismanagement in a deep sense, because while you thought there were these decades of stability, actually a great society in the world was being hollowed out completely and fell like a pack of cards. And what Joe says is, it's not that the Soviet Union could not cope with the missile policy of Ronald Reagan or the armament policy of Ronald Reagan. It is because the Soviet Union could not cope with the oncoming 21st century. You have to be able to move with the times, take the opportunities of the times, shape yourself in those circumstances. That's how you get along. You can't allow yourself to become the equivalent of a dinosaur, which we know became extinct all of a sudden. This led disappearance to another very interesting sequence, which is now better understood in looking back. We had a bipolar world, two superpowers. But that was clearly an inaccurate description because one of them was completely hollowed out. So in what sense was that a superpower anyway? How was that bipolar superpower reality? But because one of them disappeared, we said, okay, now we are in a unipolar world. But this habit we contracted only because of the two superpowers described by us such, one of them disappears, so that left one. But we didn't think that a superpower which stands alone must be able to achieve their ends as well. It has now been demonstrated, whether these are political ends or economic ends, social ends, whatever ends these are, you have to work with people to secure their ends. If on your own you can't secure these big ends, then what really is the meaning of being the sole superpower? You just exist in an abstract without being able to achieve a goal. So it seems that this term also was interestingly misleading. Then people said, well, actually what's happening is that we are in a multipolar world. Other countries are coming up, but the other countries are subject to the same things. They can't, for the same reason as the one superpower couldn't do it. They can't do it too. So in what sense are they powers if they have to all work together to secure global ends? I think Richard Haas is coming close to the truth when he said in the Foreign Affairs recent article, maybe we are in a non-polar world. And that is probably the description we are closest to. A world of total flux, politically, which is non-polar, in which many of the powers enjoy various attributes, all have to work together for these ends. As far as the economic bipolarity opposition is concerned, Paul Samuelson, who's now in his mid-90s, I think, has stopped making observations, but he did make one observation. He said that I thought the way the world is going to develop is that the North will always be the North. The North will vacate areas which the South will occupy. And that is how the world is going to move. But he says, I think my model was not right. Because, once again, this category in my mind has misled me. North is not geography. North is an ability. If somebody develops that ability, North moves there. I think this was put in another way by the president of a company. I think it was GE, Jack Welch, I think. He said, get the word multinational out of your mind. He was actually talking to CEOs. He said, get the word multinational, because multinational is based on geography. There's a headquarters in the north, and there's a rest of your operations in the rest of the world. This is not how the globalizing world is going to work. This is a world which is virtual, without any headquarters, and you have to operate in that. Technology here, obviously, is no longer the dominating strength which the North always would expect to have dominance and monopoly in. The research centers that are now being created are very diverse research centers, but this has had another evolution, which is equally significant beyond the political and the economic I mentioned, which is it has gotten rid of another term, which is appropriate technology. I lived for decades in a world where people talked about appropriate technology, which is appropriate for the South, which is a geographical idea, which is what you deserve. And to solve your problems, this is the kind of technology you need. That whole idea is now bust, because technology is neutral. You can use it for in any way you like. You can have e-governance, you can have e-health, you can have e-education, you can have distance learning, you can have a digital bridge spanning a development divide. Age-old problems can be spanned by this technology. Research centers are spawning all over. In other words, we are entering a world in which technology has become an asset for everybody, and nobody says that something is foreclosed to you. You're not foreclosed from any part of the political world. You're not foreclosed from any part of the economic world. You're not foreclosed from any part of the technological world either. The social world is another thing. You have to think about it as space. I gave one example. People said globalization actually has taken place together we've been together globalizing. Colonial era was another first area of globalization. But it's important to remember that the globalization of the colonial era was a globalization of distinct spaces. And that globalization meant that I have the authority over the space politically in terms of power, economically, in trading, but this space is very distinct from my space. Now, there is an intermingling of space, of people. The global space has now collapsed. Globalization today is of a very, very different order altogether from before. Which is why, when we say we are in a world without borders, we mean that any phenomenon which we have, we can't get it to stop anywhere, it gets globalized very, very quickly. The positive fields of globalization, if handled well, like investment, and not that hot money flies away, and we saw what happened 10 years ago in East Asia, barring all that, it is a force for the good because it makes up capital where capital is less. Investment, trade, capital movement, technology movement, tourism, all kinds of cultural interaction, which is, you might call positive, and then you have negative, also cannot be contained anymore, whether it is disease or narcotics or small arms or pornography or pedophilia, is all globalized. So you're in a space in which you cannot say that this, what is happening there, doesn't affect me anymore. It might very well do that. So when we try and evaluate, if you did a SWOT analysis of the world today, of strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and strengths, you get a very, very confused picture. Depending upon what your own insight is, you make your own SWOT analysis. I'll give you an example of what I read yesterday, the day before yesterday. I'm carrying from my office some papers about what awful shape the world is in. As far as the Commonwealth is concerned, it's true. We have about 2 billion people, and I think a good 2/3 of them live with $1 a day. If you look at primary school enrollment, if you look at child mortality, if you look at maternal mortality, if you look at all kinds of health indicators, that they just don't seem to be moving. Or at least when we do the Millennium Development Goals Review on 25th September, which is a halfway point, we'll find that we are a long way off. And this is what the Goldman Sachs report says. It was released last month. Some of you may have seen it. Goldman Sachs published a paper last week, The Expanding Middle, the Exploding World Middle Class and Falling Global Inequality. About 70 million people a year globally are entering this wealth group, as defined by those on incomes of between $6,000 and $30,000 in purchasing power parity terms. The phenomenon may continue for the next 20 years, with this global middle accelerating to 90 million a year by 2030. If this happens, an astonishing 2 billion people will have joined the ranks of the middle class. This demonstrates that contrary to widespread opinion, global inequality is declining significantly, not increasing. If you look at some of the recent books that have come out, I particularly refer to Jeffrey Sachs's. I was delighted that he was looking for the right term. What can I say about this world which is pitching us together? And the future, the name he gave was Commonwealth. Very interesting book. And the other one is by Stiglitz, Making Globalization Work. Well worth reading. By Stiglitz. Stiglitz sees the glass half empty. As expected, Jeff sees the glass half full. It's just not the ordinary reader like you and me, or an analyst, who's confused about the world. These people, who are described as the two truly global economists, and someone called them, say, the great secular preachers of our time, and so on. They've written these two books at the same time, coming to different conclusions. But what does it mean in terms of leadership? That's why I got hold of Nai's book. I think everyone has to wonder what it is that leadership demands in present times. This includes certainly the political leaders. It includes business leaders as well, corporate leaders, and not just social responsibility. I've long argued that successful business cannot be prosecuted in unsuccessful societies. Successful businesses can't be prosecuted in failed societies. They have as much of an interest, for instance, in ensuring that development assistance levels are maintained where they were promised about 40 years ago, because their own business depends upon the success of the societies which receive them. I had a long argument with the chairman of the International Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and that person kept on saying, no, this is a different world, and that is a different world. I said, no, this is one world. Either we're all making it, or we're all not making it. If you have a huge train wreck, the first question you don't ask is, who was traveling first class? This is too serious a matter. A huge challenge comes before American leadership now, at this point of elections. I have read some books recently which seem to suggest, as one reviewer said, well, maybe the American unipolar moment is now in sunset, because many people are starting to say, how do we define American leadership now? One, of course, by friend Strope Talbot, head of Brookings, he's become a leading multilateralist. A great book by a great multilateralist, which I was very happy to read. Another by Nina Hajinian, she works in the White House. She takes the same kind of lead. Fareed Zakaria, Post-American World, which everyone seems to be reading now. But most interestingly, Obama Barack, The Audacity to Hope, basically is a hastily written book, but he makes the point there very simply that it's good for America to consider leading the world where the world wants to go. That's a good, sound principle, because maybe global wisdom is at work, and that is something which is workable. So we are in the coming period at a great test of leadership there, and we have a test of leadership as far as our own developing countries are concerned, the largest number. One huge hurdle, I think, has been crossed. I was a little involved in it, because Kishore knows I chaired something called Financing for Development, which led to the Monterey Consensus. And basically, I have to tell my own group, let's not talk about polemics and so on, let's just talk about ourselves and what we need pragmatically to get from the global system of governance. And the deal was that yes, governance is important. We will make no distinction between the revenue we generate and the assistance we get, because all investment must be carried on with transparency, responsibility, and with total dedication to the responsibility which we carry. So the South will be serious about governance, and the North will be serious about resources. And resources was a big basket. One was trade. How much wealth creation is being generated by trade? We've had a big setback now in the Doha round. But in the end, sustainable development is very much, for many people, a function of sustainable exports and trade. One was debt. You cannot grow, you cannot do anything if you have an unbearable burden of debt. HIPIC actually is a Commonwealth idea, and HIPIC understood it and tried to do that. The third, of course, is your own non-anti-corruption policy so that you make the most of what you've got. Then there was development assistance, because these are capital short societies and countries, they need it. So the leadership in all organizations and in all countries has now to grasp what I feel is a moment of great opportunity, because all the openings that I have described. If you look in the past, we had a world of great constraints, but now we have a possibility before us of working towards a world in which there is a common understanding of how to go. What is the secret of this? There's no silver bullet, there never is. But if there is one, I think It is the following. I was coincidentally reading about the autobiography of Lee Kuan Yew, and quite interestingly, the title is From Third World to First. And he said in it, I have no capital, and the same thing was said by this morning Prime Minister, Foreign Minister. I have no asset at all in Singapore. The only asset I have is the people. So I think I'll concentrate on that. Now this is a very important insight because the previous world also tended to think that political policy, economic policy, social policy are separate areas. In the end, it's all human policy, which you concentrate on. Recently, the World Bank subsidized a report called the Growth Report. Nobel laureate Michael Spence, chaired it. It was released in London in Chatham House. I met him. The point of the report was to examine, I think it was 14 countries that had grown at a higher rate than 7% for 20 or 25 years. A very small select group of countries. And the object of this exercise was, where can we find common features in them so that then it becomes a lesson for the rest of the world? Look, these 13 countries did it. Singapore was, I think, one of them, of course. And so we get a great global lesson for the rest. Finally, we've made a deduction from data available. They were completely astonished to find that the experience of each country was so unique that they could not find one common policy which each one of them had followed. Not in labor, not in credit, not in the amount of protectionism they had, how open their market was, nothing, not even one, in the realm of economic policy. But they did find two, which were non-economic, and this covered the whole lot, without exception. One was that each one of them was determined to get out of the spot they were in, no matter what it took. They had simply decided through collective political will, we are not going to stay here. The second one was that each one of them gave primacy to human capital, particularly health and education. So what was the result of this great exercise? That your social policy and your economic policy is joined at the hip. Our chairman now, President Museveni, when the time came for Uganda to assume chairmanship of Commonwealth, said, I want the theme, every chairman has a theme which they pass by other members, and then we work on that theme for the next 2 years. He said, I want the theme of transformation. By transformation, I mean that I just don't want to do well in the same place anymore. I want to be in another place. And the world today is a world of opportunity and possibility is just such that I have to transform myself radically, and that is the only successful policy that I foresee. So he said, transformation is the theme. It has many elements. We are working on these elements. And he said, gave the example of Asia, and mentioned Singapore, and I think mentioned Malaysia, and gave examples of countries in Africa, which he said, in my lifetime when I was a young person, were the same level of development and per capita income. So I want to find out what happened. And this is very important because there is in social theory something called self-efficacy theory. Self-efficacy theory tells you that you learn the most from a situation with which you can identify. In other words, if a Nordic country told African countries, this is what you should do, there's not too much self-efficacy at work there. But if an Asian country, which in your recent memory was where you were, tells you what works for them, then self-efficacy works. In the Commonwealth, we are taking a cue from this, and we are trying to make the work we do even more people-centered than before. I just want to share in conclusion, you'll be happy that now I'm finally winding to a close, some of the areas in which, which we would be exploring. Firstly, we used to look at international organizations, something that exist in their own right and probably have their own laws. I think that's an incomplete way of looking at an international organization. One must read the literature of social theory and management theory, because in the end, they are institutions. All right, they're not profit-making institutions, but they are outcome-making institutions. And an insight in one world can be very, very applicable in the other one. So self-efficacy theory, which I read about in social theory, is one. The other one is, I met somebody who didn't know very much. He said, all right, tell me, what is the USP of the Commonwealth? So luckily, some of my thing came back as well as USP, right, unique selling proposition. He said, yes, in the world today, even in the international world of international organizations, the Commonwealth has to understand that a lot of other organizations are trying to do the work which they are doing. How are you convincing the world that you're doing it better, or differently, or in tune with the times? What is your USP? Everyone has to think about that. In what way are you cornering the niche? And I have some examples. For instance, the Commonwealth has the most superior debt management software in the world. 90 countries are using it. The Commonwealth has the best youth, workers, appraisal, benchmarking in the world, which many people are using. How to mainstream youth, for instance. When a turn for an idea came, the Commonwealth also gave this idea of HIPIC, as I mentioned. There are other areas. These were unique selling propositions, which by accident or simply by being an institution of knowledge workers, we hit upon. I think we have to do it in a more concentrated and deliberate way. The third one is very interesting. He's one of my very favorite authors, C.K. Prahlad of Michigan. I think some of you may have read him. Who, the competition theorist, the theory of competition he wrote, and then he said the wealth at the bottom of the pyramid, the famous book. He's just written a new one called The New Age of Innovation, in which he argues that everyone is involved in wealth creation. If you're not creating wealth, you're losing whatever you're doing. So, however you define wealth, you're involved in wealth creation. And the next wave of innovation is going to be co-creation of wealth. In other words, you can't be like Ford, which says, I think there's a huge market for this T model, and he was right. You, on your own, cannot think of that T model anymore. Whatever model you're thinking of will be co-created with the consumers and users. You must find a way of developing it themselves, which is also the new age of manufacturing. People say that mass manufacturing, in some sectors, yes, but now it's customized, user-based. Co-creation of wealth and co-creation of targets is something every institution should do. And this is something which I wish to do through a plan which we are working. We've given it a label P3. It's called the Partnership Platform Portal. All that this is creating is it's bypassing the necessity for me to ask my members for money. Because that's a desperately hard activity anyway. The question is, how can I get an outcome without asking member states for money? Just bypass that issue. I have a CFTC program, 25 million pounds. I can ask for money and say, give me more money so I can do more technical cooperation, or I can bypass my own budget and say, you are the giver, you are the user, forget about me, just give it. So you enter, you log on. This is a concept we started when I was High Commissioner. We gave that label called the science score. If someone has a buffalo disease or finds a fungus on their cassava, they log on in the cyber world and say, this is my problem, is anyone listening? And somebody should be there to prepare this package. Someone will say, I know what this is. Someone will say, my foundation is supposed to finance agriculture. Someone will say, I've just retired, I can come. Globalize. You think, why should you think, should I go to DFID in UK, or should I go to Norway, or should I go to what? You know, that's old century thinking. The new century is let the world know, let it all hang out. This is, create a science corps, and you then create what they now have a word for, which is dispersed network power. Power is no longer concentrated, power is now dispersed. So the only question is how you're going to use it. So we want to use it and co-create our own targets and our goals by talking to people who in the end are going to be our beneficiaries. The other thing which I think the Commonwealth can do in the scenario which I have sketched out is the power of thought and ideas. You don't have to be a huge organization to have a good thought. In fact, very huge organizations are constantly under assault for not having thoughts matching their budget. Commonwealth doesn't have that problem because we don't have such a budget, but we came out with HIPIC, and we've come out now with something it's called respect and understanding, called civil paths to peace, which is how can we bridge the fault lines of the world without overemphasizing simply multi-faith, interfaith differences, and bring in everything, the gender differences, the age differences, the way media is used and plays and sees its responsibilities, all of that. This is something we're going to advance, and we see how we're going to do it. The third is the strategic partnerships. I want to leverage this institution by saying, I may not have money, but I have huge credibility, huge experience, and huge ability. So if you want that outcome, which is the same as mine, then I can do it for you. My budget is not involved, your budget is involved, but this is the outcome you want. You don't have the knowledge workers to do it. Investigate them consciously and go ahead. Advance the central idea of governance. I think that we have to accept now that if core governance is lacking, then no outcome, whether social, political, or economic, can be a healthy one. I think the Commonwealth has a huge advantage because it is a strategic partner and a trusted partner. We don't do grandstanding. We don't run around taking credit or leaking stories of what a grand thing we've done to the media. One of the reasons why people are under-informed about the Commonwealth is because we don't do this. And we had a huge media expert telling us how we can do better. He says, well, if you can create more friction inside your organization, you get better coverage. I said, that's too heavy a price for me to pay. We are in the world of making convergence and consensus. If, as a result of that, I'm not on the front page of your papers, that's a price I'm prepared to pay. But we are in the world of harmony, not in the world of disharmony. Next, inclusive globalization. It's extremely important that the idea that globalization is not about emerging economies, it's about everybody takes root. And I've often said in my first statement, I said, every human community, irrespective of size and endowment, has a right to national salvation and to a place in the sun. And I've also argued that if in your national politics you cannot suffer inequality, you cannot suffer injustice, if you say no child left behind, no village left behind, no region left behind, we must have equalization of opportunity. Why is this model wrong for the world? Just because they don't vote for you? That's not sufficient reason. In the world today, all avenues of philosophical thinking, whether based on pragmatism, materialism, utilitarianism, morals, or ethics, point to the same way, which is an inclusive humanity. Otherwise, there's no humanity which is worth achieving. Of target groups, youth and women. Youth simply because they are the ones who are going to live through this century. Because they are the ones on whose shoulders you are transferring all the incompetences with which the world is now burdened and said, all right, good luck to you, this is what you've got to solve. So I think Commonwealth in its youth program must be what we call mainstreaming the youth, not just saying there's a youth department. is how is every department not taking a patronizing attitude towards young people, because in the revolution we have today, there's also another enormous psychological revolution, which is our understanding of wisdom. A person, when I was 30 years old, if I wanted the answer to a question, I would probably approach an older person. A person who's 30 today will probably approach a younger person. The association of wisdom with the passage of time is over, except for the era of spirituality and the area of spirituality. The youth are your future not only because they will live longer, but also because they have the aptitude and because also they have, hopefully, the instinct for self-survival. There was a horrible sentence in Martin's great book, The Meaning of the 21st Century. He says, when I see the world today, sometimes I think that we are not going to survive because our policy here is wrong, our policy there is wrong, which it is. But because the way we have developed, technologically, having lost all moral sense, having lost all sense of our human potential in pursuit of everything that is outside of us and not inside of us, and because of all of this, we may have lost our instinct for self-preservation. And if you've lost that, how are you going to survive? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamalesh. I think you've covered a very wide area. You've already made two major contributions to the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, by the way. The first major contribution he's made is that you can see that the Commonwealth Secretary General has got time to read more books than academics or students have. I think you've read more books than most people in the audience have. And secondly, of course, you made a very important point at one stage when you said that if you send someone to a Nordic country, your point about self-efficacy, right?
Yeah.
It's difficult for him to relate to the Nordic experience because it is so far away. But if you can send the same person to Asia, he understands and benefits more, and therefore can learn more about development. And we thought that we could use that someday as an advertisement for the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
Mr. Benny's point. I'll send you what he said.
That's what he said, is it? Oh, good, wonderful. So we'll use that as a quote when we publicize the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So anyway, on that note, can I throw the floor? We have another half an hour, so please feel free to ask questions. You can see he can touch on any area you want to. So please, over to you. Please identify yourself, and if you don't mind, a short, sharp question. Thank you.
Sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, Professor Kishore Mahbubani and Mr. Kamalesh Sharma. My name is Wee, a Singapore citizen. The title of the lecture is fascinating. If I understand it correctly, the Holy Grail, in economic terms, represents the modus operandi of a time-tested and effective economic model, which has universal application for national development. Now, my question is, out of the 53 nations that make up the Commonwealth, can you identify one country that is holding the Holy Grail? Thanks.
The answer is Singapore.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for that. It's not only the correct answer, but it's the only answer I can dare to give right here. Now, I tell you something about the Commonwealth, and it's important to recognize this. Our two pillars are democracy and development. In another way, you can say governance and growth. I think a third one is globalism, which I spoke about, which is a globalist outlook. Anyway, let that pass. In governance, the index of democratic freedom, which is usually seen as by the economist. In the first 50 countries of the world, out of 53, only about 13 or 14 Commonwealth countries find place. Most of them are at the bottom of the list. Some are described as hybrid democracies, some as incomplete democracies, some as authoritarian states. They have a whole menu of classifications. But mainly to suggest that these are not satisfactory democracies. This is very important because the Commonwealth is acting in the firm belief in governance, in the knowledge that there's a long, long way for us to cover. I'm not saying that everything the economist says is holy writ. By no means. There are other ways of looking at it. So we have adopted these principles starting in January 71 in Singapore. It was for the 91 in Harare. Then we had the Millbrook Action Group, Ministers' Action Group 2. We are the only organization that scrutinizes, sits on judgment on whether there has been derogation on these principles, and many countries have been asked not to be members anymore. And it's the only organization which actually asked members to leave. Then there was Aberdeen, which is local self-governance and so on. So we have done this for 40 or 50 years. There's no organization in the world. But of course, the terrain is such that no one can be said as perfect example. No one by any stretch of imagination. Same thing about development. The index that is most read is the Human Development Report of the UN or UNDP. If you look at the development record of Commonwealth countries, same position. Very few in the top half, most of them in the lower half. But we do think that emphasis on institution building, on sustainable and durable development, on institutions, so that you have inherent strengths and tensile strengths inside your society is what will carry you eventually through. And we have examples that of Singapore and other states which points to the fact that if your basic policies on human capital and institutions is a thought through one, you can move very, very quickly. And the Commonwealth encourages that.
Thank you. Next question. I'm surprised.
You ask.
No.
Good evening, sir. My name is Kevin Yao, Singapore national. What I have, the question is, the miracle of sustained compounded growth of nations, right, is at the end. Is it at the end? Because we are now hitting a roadblock. The roadblock is called 385 parts per million. CO2. The reality of global warming. If we have already exceeded the carrying capacity of the Earth, we are past the tipping point, probably past the point of no return. What will happen? Isn't all this, or what to call it, the points about governance moot? Because the reality, the indelible reality, is that the future might be one of severely constrained, there will be no growth. It will be managed decline. Or maybe what to call it, unmanageable decline. And then there's another issue I'd like to raise, right? That you mentioned about the 25 or so states, right, that managed to achieve 7% sustained compounded growth for a period of 20 to 30 years. Isn't one of the common factors, right, of those states that's unmentioned, that it was thanks to a hegemon, the USA in particular, that permitted those states to engage in export-led growth. The hegemon was willing to absorb the punishment and pay the price, right, for export-led growth from those states, right, and that was why those states grew that fast at that accelerated level.
Yes, thank you. Well, for the second question, yes, some states followed a free trade policy and profited as a result. But in this example, there were also states that have grown extremely well with policies that actually protected their own industry and released it very gradually. There was no economic or political single lesson which was learned. You could have said, all right, if people who were closely aligned to the United States did better, that was also not the case. As for your first question, environment is absolutely right. Somebody said that if some space traveler has visited this planet every 10 years and saw what they were doing to themselves, the report that they will be sending back is that, this is probably a space lunatic asylum where people can't even figure out the basic facts of how they can preserve the life which has been given to them and are assiduously engaged in destroying it by every means possible. Luckily, the point of no return has not been reached. And our exercise, which we did in June for the reform of international institutions, this is the first time we had a mini summit, and we have a declaration, has 3 elements in it, which will now be endorsed hopefully by all the members in New York. One was the guidelines of United Nations, coherence in the UN system. Second was the IFIs, World Bank, and the IMF, and what should their global delivery module be now in today's world. And the third was environmental governance. Because when faced with severe threats, the UN was created to prevent a third world, basically, the Security Council. IMF was created to prevent, macroeconomic financial difficulties and exchange difficulties. They created it. World Bank was created as IBRD to reconstruct Europe, later poverty. When you had a need, you created it. But it's one of the unexplained psychological factors of our collective life that the sense of urgency pertaining to the environment is just not picking up that much. And you have a point that by the time it picks up, I hope it's not too late. But that may not be the case after Rome and Copenhagen we're going to see. But I think there still is time for us to have these policies in place so that there can be gradual reversion of what the harm we've done.
Thank you. I actually have a question about foreign aid, I mean, as you know, Kamalesh, you and I discussed that in New York sometimes. It's amazing what a large percentage of foreign aid gets wasted in one way or another. Often most of it gets recycled back to the donor countries, Now that you're in a position where you have to sort of, in a sense, you meet the donor countries and you meet the recipient countries in the Commonwealth, what do you find to be the most effective ways of actually achieving the goals of development aid? You mentioned some examples about direct connections within someone whose buffalo is sick and so on and so forth. What are the other ways of improving the effectiveness of foreign aid?
You're right. In development theory, there are any number of books written on what went wrong. So that is all known terrain. My own view is that the world is now interconnected at all levels. For the first time, that which is local is connected with that which is remote, in a harmful sense and a positive sense as well. The world now operates at 4 levels, which is local. Then comes the in-between state, if you have states like India does and some other countries, state level. The regional level, one of the great lessons of Europe and ASEAN and some of the Mercosur, some of these other countries, you must think of regions as lifting themselves, not just individual states. And then the global level. There's to be coherence and harmony at all of these levels. And my view is that the best way in which aid can be employed now is for aid to go straight to the beneficiary on the grassroots level with responsible mechanisms and let most of it be used directly by the beneficiary and let them develop the mechanisms to see how well it is used, reporting and benchmarking. The reason is that unless you do that, then I don't think you're going to do very much with the Millennium Development Goals. The MDGs have 2 legs to stand on growth. If you have growth, it's good, because more wealth creation in a society means that something is happening. If I have a job, I can take care of the literacy of my children and hopefully, look after my family and the health of everybody. So your MDGs are met for my family. But since you're not going to have growth of that magnitude which has been seen in the developed world, you need direct affirmative action with resources. Which is why, and you're right, you must find ways in which they're not wasted, but these ways are known now. I fear that the inability of the world to lift itself, not lift itself to 0.7%, apart from Nordic states and the Netherlands and 1 or 2 others, is simply because they're always looking for a reason why it will not have the results which we expect from it. It is simply not taking the financial responsibility seriously enough.
Thank you. Next question. First here and then there. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Your Excellency, my name is Tang Li. I work as a part-time writer. I was very intrigued that you mentioned this phrase, direct affirmative action. Do you see the possibility that the Commonwealth may develop the need to impose its will on some member countries, like where you have instances where you have countries like Zimbabwe, which have blatantly flouted every international law known to man, and yet what can we do except talk about it, we can complain about it, we can say Robert Mugabe is a bad man, but at the end of the day, what can we can't do anything about it, we just say this is non-interference, let's leave him alone. I mean, what is the relevance of the Commonwealth and international organizations like the UN if at the end of the day the country with the most weapons decides the way the world works?
Well, you know, I think the Commonwealth has done the most of any organization in encouraging political internalization of governance standard setting. People don't, as I said when I was speaking, we don't advertise this, perhaps some of this we should advertise. Africa has made very rapid strides in these governance goals through NAPAD and through peer review mechanism, which the process they have started. Most of it draws its inspiration through the work of the 18 Commonwealth countries in the African Union, in line with what Commonwealth had already done. This is a self-efficacy theory. It was done there, so it can be done. In the Pacific, the Biketawa Declaration is a mirror regionally for the Pacific states, small states, the Pacific Forum, of what the Commonwealth had done. So the Commonwealth is doing a lot, because unless you internalize this, you cannot have an external agency doing this. You can have an instrument, but that's very difficult to create. It's called RTP now, right to protect. Responsibility to protect. But now, you know, we've had instances in the past where in Rwanda we had it in Cambodia and many others, where the Security Council could have acted because it was basically law and security potentially an issue. They wanted to. Politics comes in the way. So right now, we are in that interregnum period when basically we don't know what to do when things go badly wrong. But as far as the Commonwealth is concerned, countries have been suspended in the past and readmitted. Pakistan was one, Fiji is another, Nigeria there was another. Zimbabwe withdrew voluntarily because it suspected it was the point of being suspended. So we have done that. We said, look, if you don't follow, and I think this has a great suasive power in our member states. So I think of all the organizations, we've probably done the most, but that's not a global solution.
Okay,
Thank you. Next question up there. And then the lady on top.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kamalesh, Sharma. My name is Raymond. What I hear during your speech is that some of the key points you mentioned is about global networking, collaboration, creating wealth together, inclusiveness, equal opportunities. I would assume that one of the things is that global collaboration and trade should result in greater creation of wealth and more equality for rich and poor nations. But however, from what I observed, that it seems that oftentimes international trade results in tensions. For example, China and the States, and in the past Japan and the States. And because China has a huge surplus of budget surplus, and in fact, resulting in some industries in America, for example, the automobile industry almost collapsed some of the industries, okay, and they're fighting back. And the other example is about the globalization, about the oftentimes there's a tension about this wherever it goes about this movement of globalization. There's always pros and cons about some who are for it and some against it. I wonder what is the stand of the Commonwealth regarding this matter. does globalization actually resulting in creation of wealth for the poor nations and narrowing of the income gap between the rich and the poor? Does it actually create a wider gap between the rich and the poor nations? Thank you.
Globalization as a phenomenon is a wealth-creating phenomenon. And I draw a distinction between globalization and globalism. Globalism is having a globalist outlook, which is that you pursue policies which are good for the world, and not just wealth creation, but wealth creation for everybody. Trade exchanges are usually beset by friction because it's very difficult to come to a balance of advantages between importing and exporting nations. The biggest catastrophe of the last century was because of this, because of trade wars and mutual protectionism, wave of protectionism, which created a depression in America and a currency collapse in Germany, and the devastation which brought the fascists to power. And you see what happened. The great lesson learned from that was that you need a rule-based trading system. You need a mutually advantageous trading system and not a mutually hostile trading system. But as you go along, since the first round, the Tokyo round, last Uruguay round, this round, the more rounds you do, the difficulty is that you're not talking anymore about trade stopping at the custom house. You're not talking only of commodity trade or merchandise trade. You're talking about trade and services. You're talking about intellectual property, talking about procurement policy, and so on. Now, this becomes extremely intrusive. And many of the countries are ready for a trade deal, but they're not ready to lose their sovereignty completely on everything. To have, for instance, an international investment agreement, which was tried shortly after the Hong Kong meeting some time ago. So you're now entering areas in which the inequality between what Naira Wood in one of our articles said, the rule makers and the rule takers, is once again coming forward because of the weakness of the rule takers and the strength of the rule makers. This is where you need not globalization moving forward. You need globalism moving forward to think about the position. It is admitted when you say special and differential treatment, SDT, in the earlier GATT, it recognized that you are in an uneven playing field. This uneven playing field hasn't gone away because you're in the 21st century. It's become uneven in other ways. And you simply have to have a regime where the balance of benefit takes into account this unevenness. But if you can't do this, then I think we're heading for another catastrophe.
Thank you. The lady up there, please. Then, yeah. Go ahead, please.
My name is Amrita and I work as a researcher in India. My question to you is, sir, that in your opinion, how important do you think is economic growth alone when we're searching for the Holy Grail? And I ask this especially in the context where we're in a world today, we're talking about making globalization work, we're talking about inclusive growth, because there is a certain acknowledgement that certain sections of society and certain communities and people have been left behind in the entire process. Thank you.
Yes, I think growth is important because growth addresses the problem of scarcity of capital and wealth, which is the definition of poverty. Unless you're growing and creating more wealth for yourself, then you're permanently poor. And if the choice between you is an equality of poverty and an inequality of growth, it is better to choose the second one, provided you can at the same time attend to the consequences of it. Because there are very few countries, I'm not an economic historian, but it's hard to think of a country where the growth has not been lumpy. The whole notion of social democratic politics in Europe and here was the social safety net. And the meaning was that if you're growing as a society, there will always be people who will require that net because they're not in the gravy. They're not in the gravy train. So they manage the social consequences by creating this. And societies that are growing very fast, in part, will then get pulled apart by people who have absolutely no stake in what is taking place. Unless that stake is created for them, they will inevitably be pulled apart. It's happening in a lot of countries already.
Thank you. Gentleman over here, then up there. Yes, please go ahead.
Hello. My name is Nai. I'm a Burmese national doing business in Singapore. My question is for His Excellency, Mr. Sharma. It's related to your topic, the society that works. I'm very interested in this topic. And you mentioned that the indicator to measure a society development is two indicators. One is a democratic governance and a development, which is practically growth and economic growth, right? So I think in economic growth area, I think most society, like regional organization, they're already doing a lot in terms of free trade agreements, opening borders for investment and other things related to economics. But of course, we also have to emphasize on the democratic governance, without which we cannot say that a society is already developed, right? So my question is there any specific example that Commonwealth as an organization can share, things that Commonwealth is taking to improve the democratic governance of its member countries, so that we all can learn from that experience, the things that works to improve the democratic governance, which is very crucial, in my view, for the development of any society.
Yes, we are, and I alluded to it. These are creating internal strengths in our member states. And this is done basically by, we have several programs already. Some have been very successful, but I have a long way to go still, because, we have heard of a lot of oppositions and polarities in the world on technology and trade and wealth and so on. But one of the biggest polarities, which is not sufficiently recognized, is between new independent states and old independent states. The value systems which the new independent states have to adhere to are the systems developed by the old independent states over centuries. That is a product which is given to you. You cannot use the argument that because I'm 25 years old, I think I'll do about 50% of this. That is unthinkable in terms of the rights which people must enjoy. But what this does mean is that the stability which the old states get through passage of time, trial and error, trying out things and entrench themselves as a democratic polity is not available. So repeatedly when a test comes, the test is not always successfully met. We've seen that in Kenya and we've seen that in Zimbabwe just now. Zimbabwe and Kenya, till quite recently, were spoken of as very successful African societies, and I'm sure in the time to come they will. But when that huge crunch came of the transfer of power, there was something which was not there. Their experience had not provided it. But the institution has to do it. The election commission, for instance, has to be credible, has to be independent, has to be transparent, has to have people of the highest pedigree, has to be constitutionally protected, has to have control over the security forces as to what they want to do. This has to be done now, not through experience, but simply through practice which they have to institute right now. This is the challenge. This is what we do all the time in constitutional government and institutional building and governance.
So my questions, a follow-up one is Commonwealth helping their member countries to improve their governance?
Yes, all of them at all times, in different ways.
Yes.
Some of them want help because they want legal drafting. Some of them want us to actually give them judges, because they don't have the judges who will be able to pass the quality of judgment they want. Some of them want election observers, many of them, so that we can point out the weaknesses this time so they can take care of it later. And so on. There are a menu of about 20 things which we do.
So in this case, the member country has to request first. Are you suggesting?
Yes, we are need driven. We don't inflict our goodwill on others. We want people to ask us for things.
Okay.
And he's a very generous soul. He always helps. Gentleman up there first, and then there's one below that. Yes. Okay, go ahead. We'll go in terms of green, brown, and orange. Okay, green.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, my name is Saad. I'm a student of public policy at LKY. My question has to do with what you described as a unique selling proposition and how everybody must develop it these days, right? And when you consider this with respect to countries, I feel personally that, developing a unique selling proposition does not go in harmony with the increased globalization of the world. For instance, I'm from Pakistan and I've witnessed that under the new WTO rules, the government must stop subsidizing the textile industry, and the textile industry was the USP of Pakistan. And this has, over the past 2 years, stunted the growth of the industry. So this, especially when we consider with the theory of Santos, who's from Brazil, and he's given the dependency theory, and he argues for, he says that, there is absolute growth and then there is relative growth, and as long as you have the West, which is growing at a faster rate than the South, right? You won't be able to achieve any sort of parity in the world, and there will always be political and economic clashes. So, what is your take on this? I mean, can countries really focus on developing a USP in a highly globalized world of today?
Yeah, you can, by keeping pace with the changes. I'm not sure whether your example of textile is the perfect one, though. Probably bananas is a better example. Because if you think you can have a high rate of growth by simply, selling bananas till kingdom come, those countries are having a problem because they didn't think ahead of what it is that they could substitute bananas with. As far as textile is concerned, in fact, the multi-fiber agreement in the Uruguay round, to a large extent, because it was backloaded by 10 years, did take care of more freedom in trade of textiles. But in a world which is changing around you, you cannot have a static USP. Your USP has to be mobile with the mobile world. You have to keep on engaging. If I take manufacturing, you may be very good at manufacturing. The great manufacturing part of the world, UK, has now 3 million workers left. Germany is different. 40% of their exports in manufacturing. They had the USP in the 19th century. They maintained it. How did they maintain it? Through a conscious policy to change what they were doing in a changing world. Same is with services export, whatever export you want to do.
Next, please go ahead.
Sure. My name's Howard, and I'm with the Strategic Policy Office in the Prime Minister's Office. So I was particularly interested in your observation that in the modern world there's been a disillusion of this hard geographic paradigm. And I'd like to ask about how this affects the relevancy and the identity of international organizations with the dissolution of this geographic paradigm. Because we see a lot of international as well as regional organizations are still bound by hard geographic location rules. We see that this tends to throw together strange bedfellows with Myanmar and ASEAN and Turkey and the EU. How does that affect the development of international organizations, particularly with alternative theories floated by recent presidential candidate in the United States, John McCain, has suggested the formation of a League of Democracies as an alternative to the United Nations. So could you also particularly comment on this from the perspective of the Commonwealth, which has a unique history of its membership being originally constituted a shared historical and political legacy, which has evolved into a more cultural and ideological one over the years?
Yeah, well, I'm not in favor of binary visions. I'm this and you're that, me and the other. I'm a League of Democracy, someone else is not. Someone else may consider they're a democracy, or they're trying very hard to get there, but to type them and to classify them in a kind of this morphology of, it's not helpful. A global view must embrace everyone, and everyone is at various stages. Because every country, depending upon who is doing this classification, can be put in a very uncomplimentary position. Any country, without exception. So I'm not sure whether these kind of divisions, which imply a permanent kind of superiority with one, are very helpful. Your question about the organization is a very pertinent one, except that every organization is in a different position. Now, take IMF and World Bank, the articles of association are such, and the notions of power sharing and voting, and the rights which the formula on which these votes are distributed are such that it pulls them down from doing a lot of very quick reform. Because those people that should be served through these institutions are not in a position, because of that structure, to have their voices heard and listened to and do something about it. And the United Nations is probably better in this respect, because they're a collection of countries and member states. And member states can design their own programs in the way to move forward. But every organization has to see what the outcome and what the delivery is in today's world and whether you're using all the means available to them. The biggest obstacle is what is my understanding, what is my knowledge base from which I am talking. If my understanding is defective about how the world is proceeding, then all of my formulas are going to be half-baked too. That's a very big issue now, the kind of people who are doing the decision making. But I think the world catches up with them as well.
Thank you. The last question is from the gentleman in orange. We have reached our hour of 5:30. So.
I'm Tarun, I'm a student here. The first question that I would like to ask you, and only then I can proceed, is do you represent the same Commonwealth which offers Commonwealth DFID shared scholarships?
What scholarship? Yeah,
Okay.
the Commonwealth Scholarship and Fellowship Program is
Okay.
something we are affiliated with. The Commonwealth is an intergovernmental body. Then you have a huge civil society segment and a huge business segment, but we are all joined at the hip.
So it's the one which offers along with DFID, right? To the students of developing countries.
Yeah, that's the one.
So
At least I think so.
Can the students of Lee Kuan Yew School apply for their scholarships?
in that case, my question would be both to you and to the chair. Commonwealth DFID shared scholarships offers students from developing countries.
DFID. No, I'm sorry. The DFID is different.
But it offers a shared scholarship along with Commonwealth.
DFID is the Department for International Development.
Which the government
That is
of
the
UK.
UK government,
Yeah, correct.
yes.
No, but they share a scholarship along with Commonwealth, right?
Yeah, I think they may be managing some scholarships together. I don't know, Simon, do you know about this? Some of them are managed together, but basically it's the UK government.
Okay, in any case,
They
I'll
have
ask the question.
Chevening scholarships and DFID is different.
Still, I'll ask the question anyways.
Yeah, no, carry on.
The clause that they give along with the scholarship is that students who come from developing countries will do their master's degree in those countries. And then the clause is that you have to go back to your own country. You cannot work there.
You're talking about which country you're talking about?
About India?
India?
No, he says, sorry, will you finish your question first?
Yeah. And on the other hand, ANUS offers scholarships for undergrad students where they have a clause asking them to stay over for 3 years. So I basically want to understand the rationale that these two different agencies follow in creating an educated workforce for developing countries.
Okay.
Luckily, I can say that the Commonwealth is not associated with any such irrationality.
I know someone who got this scholarship along with Commonwealth and DFID and who was forced to come back.
In the UK, I can tell you not Commonwealth, it's previous High Commissioner of India to the UK. The UK earlier used to insist that you go back after you'd finished your scholarship. Then they said you can stay on for 1 year. Then Scotland said you can stay on for 2 years. Then the rest of UK said, all right, you can also stay on for 2 years. So I think now it is that. As far as the US is concerned, it's very different. The US wants to draw this intellectual pool into their own system and make them stay. But you know, I'm absolutely the wrong person to be asking these questions, to be perfectly honest.
But anyway, just briefly to answer your question, you're right. There are very different objectives of scholarship schemes, okay? And some, like in the United States of America, the scholarship schemes are designed to draw talent into the countries. And that in some ways is similar to what the National University of Singapore also does, to draw talent here. But the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy is actually, the goal of our scholarships is to produce the next generation of leaders, public servants, and others in developing countries. So we actually encouraged our scholarship holders to go back to their countries and make a difference. So in that sense, we share the goal of the Commonwealth in trying to promote good governance and development around the world. Now let me close with two final remarks. I was struck by many things that Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma said in his remarks, but one of the things I'm going to go back and think about, and which really upset me, was his comment that now we should no longer turn to old people for wisdom, but to young people. No? I spent 60 years of my life trying to get old, and now he's saying don't listen to old people like me. But I agree with you that it's the young people today who understand the world better than we do. The second piece of good news is that you notice that Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma spoke quite a bit about the work of the World Bank Growth Commission that was led by Michael Spence. I don't know whether you've officially announced it yet, but Michael Spence, the Nobel laureate, will be coming to the Institute of Policy Studies, which is part of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, to speak about his report sometime next month. I think there'll be an announcement coming up. So we'll keep up the conversation going about the development issues. And here I want to thank Ambassador Kamalesh Sharma. I know he's got this remarkable range of experience in diplomacy, in working in East Timor, in working in the Commonwealth Secretariat. So to combine all that wisdom and then to share it with us, of course, is a huge gift, and I hope you'll now join me in thanking him for the time. Thank you.